Thank you everyone for coming to this, what is a very special edition of Revolutionizing Healthcare. It's our 20th session in this series, so thank you very much for making this possible. We will talk today about machine learning for clinicians and one very special tool that the Schaar Lab is going to release this week, and today is our great reveal. It's the next generation of machine learning tools, which we hope will help clinicians to really embrace machine learning and can use it in a very easy, straightforward, and interpretable manner. But first, before we start, a few words about Revolutionizing Healthcare itself. So we started this whole journey on the 29th of September in 2020. This is like, the date is a bit wrong, but 2 years ago, we started this almost to the day. All the sessions we have done so far are available on YouTube, and the topics include things from early cancer detection, organ transplantation, ICU care, clinical trials, synthetic data, and much, much more. You can find it all on the Schaar website and our YouTube channel. So please feel free to go and refer to there whenever you find some interest in one of those topics. We are happy to engage over 500 clinicians every session. This is our list where all the emails go to, and we have always a great turnout, and people watch on YouTube afterwards. And they come from 31 countries all over the world. So it's really nice to see that Revolutionizing Healthcare is reaching clinicians all over the world. And we're very excited to use this platform today to reveal our great new tool, which we call AutoPrognosis. And how the session will go, we will start with an introduction right here, where I will tell you just who will be here to talk about the new program and discuss it later. Mihaela will give an introduction to AutoPrognosis 2.0, which we are going to reveal today. We have Dr. McKinney here, who will give us the clinical perspective on why this tool is important and helpful. And we have Dr. Tom Callender here, who has been using the tool for his real-life work case, which he will be presenting. And then we will have a roundtable with some great experts who will give their perspective on this new tool as well. I would like to say that this is the first of a double header in our AutoPrognosis journey. So today we will introduce the tool, and then we will be back on 21st of November with our next Revolutionizing Healthcare session, where we will go a little bit more depth. And hopefully by this time, a lot of people have already tried out the program and can give their perspective. And we will have a nice discussion about what can be done with the tool, what has been tried out, and how can you do smart and very creative things with the tool. For our today's session, we have, as I said, we have Mihaela giving the introduction, and then we have Dr. McKinney, who is part of the Cambridge Center for Eye Medicine here in Cambridge, and also a university lecturer in renal medicine. We have Dr. Thomas Callender, who is the one who had this real-life case tackled with AutoPrognosis. He is a Wellcome Trust Clinical Training Fellow in Respiratory Medicine at UCL. And then we have our three guests for the roundtable later, and we're very excited to welcome you three here. Thank you very much for coming. We have Professor Donald Ingber, who's coming to us from Harvard University, where he's the founding director of the Wyss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering, and also Julia Faulkman Professor of Vascular Biology in Harvard. We have Professor Suetonia Palmer, who's coming all the way from New Zealand in a very great way of Zoom connecting clinicians and researchers from all over the world. She's a professor of medicine at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And we have Dr. Paul Goldsmith, who is a consultant neurologist, NHS Clinical Senate member, and non-executive director of medicines and healthcare products in the regulatory agency MHRA. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. If you have questions from the audience at any time during the talks and during the discussion later in the end, please put them into the chat. I will either read the questions then afterwards during our Q&A, or we will call you up to ask the question yourself and engage into your discussion with our experts. And now I will hand over to Mihaela, who will give the first introduction on AutoPrognosis.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. I'm really very excited and thankful to you all for joining. I am excited because it is our 20th anniversary, but I'm also excited because I really hope that today we are going to present to you a tool which we find useful, and hopefully you will find it useful and be able to use it and engage with. This tool is called AutoPrognosis 2.0, and it is aimed at democratizing diagnostic and prognostic modeling in healthcare using an automated and interpretable machine learning solution. We really believe that machine learning can empower the entire healthcare ecosystem. By using data from a variety of sources, machine learning can build analytics to empower clinicians. It can provide personalized recommendations for patients. It can provide drug discovery support for clinical research and development. But also it can empower through analytics and operational support tools hospital administrators, provide recommendations and guidelines for healthcare bodies such as the NHS, and provide public health analysis and public recommendations to a variety of policymakers involved in the healthcare ecosystem. But how really to enable all this? How to democratize machine learning? There are many challenges to enable the use of machine learning for this variety of stakeholders. Here are just some of the many challenges. We have numerous machine learning models available, and their performance can drastically vary. Different machine learning models may work differently for different data sets and different tasks. Machine learning often requires state-of-the-art knowledge to train effectively. I often see in the clinical or bioinformatics community people using machine learning without the appropriate knowledge of machine learning, and hence their models are often inadequately trained or validated. Also, machine learning models may need to be repeatedly updated as more data or different data is collected. An example like this is in the era of COVID, where additional data and biomarkers were continuously measured over time. Also, machine learning needs to be transparent and easy to debug and understand, both for the designers of the various tools, but also for clinicians and patients that may use these tools. Machine learning also needs to remain state-of-the-art. The machine learning community is a very vibrant community, and we are continuously developing new and better tools. So we need to have a framework and an ecosystem where we can easily integrate state-of-the-art machine learning methods and be able to use them. Last but not least, we want to have reproducible machine learning results. Currently, many people come up with a risk score either based on a statistical or a machine learning method, and these methods are not reproducible. The way in which the methods have been developed, the way in which the parameters or hyperparameters have been used, and more generally, how the framework was constructed is not possibly to reproduce because the software engine that has created this analytics is not publicly and freely available. And I would like to make an additional point. We really would like to have a situation where machine learning in healthcare is free for patients, for clinicians, for medical researchers. We are not always pleased with scenarios in which one particular company or startup may hold a particular tool. They may not want to release it to be debugged and freely available, or may charge for its use. We really believe that we need to have transparent, robust, and trustworthy and reproducible, as well as free machine learning in healthcare. Another challenge is the fact that we have many diseases, and ideally, if we are thinking about empowering clinicians and patients, as well as healthcare bodies such as the NHS, we need to deal with creating prognostic and diagnostic scores for many diseases. And this may encompass different variables. And as I mentioned before, the needs as well as the variables that enter in these models may vary over time. So how to really democratize machine learning and address the various challenges I mentioned before? One important way in which we believe this can be done is by enabling machine learning itself to craft machine learning scores. And this is possible by using an automated and interpretable machine learning framework that we call AutoPrognosis. My lab has worked for many years already on building automated machine learning frameworks. And you can see more about this on our website under the research pillars. I'd like, before I go on, to mention that the word automated here doesn't stand for automating the clinicians or medical researchers, quite the opposite. The word automated here means automating the machine learning researchers such that clinicians, medical researchers, data scientists, and many others can have access to state-of-the-art, reproducible, and interpretable machine learning tools. So the automation is on us and not on you. And this is an important distinction because I do not believe that machine learning can ever do medicine. But what I do believe is that machine learning can provide interpretable, trustworthy, and reproducible, actionable information in the form of personalized risk scores, personalized recommendations, data-driven hypotheses, all to empower clinicians and patients alike. And this is why in 2017, together with my former PhD student, Mihaela, we have built AutoPrognosis, a tool for crafting clinical score. This work has appeared for the first time in our conference, ICML 2018. And the focus was to take a clinical data set and build analytical pipelines formed of imputation, feature processing, classification, and calibration. The focus was to create both predictions as well as issue explanations associated with these predictions. While the early work envisioned this entire ecosystem, not all the features initially envisioned were implemented. However, AutoPrognosis, even the first version of AutoPrognosis, was widely used in practice. We and our collaborators, as well as others, have used it in 2018 for cystic fibrosis, in 2019 for cardiovascular disease, in 2020 for prostate cancer, on hip arthroplasty in 2020. We used it together with NHS for COVID-19, for breast cancer in 2021, and for cervical discectomy and fusion very recently in 2022. The only project I'd like to briefly highlight is our collaboration with NHS Digital, where early in the pandemic, by using AutoPrognosis, we are able to provide for NHS the first tool for predicting demand for intensive care beds and ventilators. This was possible because a tool like AutoPrognosis was readily available. But as I mentioned before, AutoPrognosis, the original version of AutoPrognosis, was only enabling a few of the features that we would like. So in the last year, together with my brilliant team, my postdoc Fergus Imri, my brilliant machine learning engineer, Bogdan Cebere, and my brilliant and close collaborator, clinical collaborator, Eoin McKinney, we came together to build AutoPrognosis 2.0. You can read about this work in a paper that we have recently archived. Also, we have developed an entire website associated with it that contains a variety of resources and a variety of ways to engage with it. I'm going to discuss a few today, but I invite you to take a look at the website itself, and the website is going to grow over the next weeks and months. What can AutoPrognosis 2.0 do? Again, the goal is to democratize machine learning for anyone interested in developing new clinical risk scores, personalized diagnostic, and prognostic. AutoPrognosis 2.0 is an open source, easy to use, state-of-the-art, interpretable machine learning package. It can be used by experts as well as non-experts. You do not need to know machine learning or even Python to be able to use it. The people that can engage with it will hopefully be clinicians, clinical researchers, data scientists, bioinformaticians, healthcare professionals, and hopefully many others. AutoPrognosis 2.0 takes a raw medical data that needs to be curated by an expert clinician or as an expert informatician that knows what questions he or she wants to ask. That part cannot be automated. But given that particular curated data set and the question at hand, AutoPrognosis can provide analytics, inclusively imputed data sets, optimized pipelines for machine learning, and train predictive models. AutoPrognosis 2.0 can issue both the best predictive pipeline as well as an aggregate of different types of pipelines. In terms of output, we are providing a large variety of model explanations on the basis of which these models can be debugged as well as understood, as well as clinical demonstrators. I'll tell a few more words about each one of these in a little bit. Here you can see the various tools that were envisioned part of these tools were envisioned in the original version of AutoPrognosis, but not implemented. Now AutoPrognosis implements them and goes one step further. We have numerous methods for data imputation, for dimensionality reduction, for feature scaling, for classification, and note that we have methods from both statistics as well as machine learning. We also are able, unlike in the first version of AutoPrognosis, to do not only predictions, but also time to event analysis. And finally, we have a large number of interpretability methods that can explain and interpret the predictions being made. So what challenges can AutoPrognosis 2.0 help you address? First, developing powerful machine learning pipelines. So it provides you with state-of-the-art machine learning tools that can automate pipeline configuration, performing missing data imputation, feature processing, model selection, and hyperparameter optimization. Also, AutoPrognosis is able to understand the value of machine learning and when it is necessary. I do not believe that machine learning goes against statistics, quite the opposite. Machine learning and statistics can join forces and solve the variety of challenges in the clinical setting. And one thing that AutoPrognosis can enable you to do is to understand what is the value of machine learning models as opposed to more traditional statistical models, since the statistical models also form part of AutoPrognosis ecosystem. So you can see how you can compare the two statistical methods versus machine learning methods, and also combine them within the AutoPrognosis ecosystems to get better performance. Also, we are able with AutoPrognosis to determine the value of the different information that is put in this AutoPrognosis system. This could be well-known clinical variables or potentially other variables that you may think are of interest, or even other variables that you may wonder whether they may play an impact on the entire population or a subset of the population. Another challenge is understanding and debugging machine learning models. We do not want opaque models, but rather interpretable machine learning models. So this is why we have a large number of interpretability models, interpretability methods that allow post hoc interpretability of the AutoPrognosis pipelines, thereby being able to understand and debug the methods. Also, we want to make machine learning models accessible and usable, And this is why we provided this platform, this free open source platform to use. Also, we are enabling web-based applications in this way, in a very easy way. And if you take a look in our paper, an example is given on how you can use the UK Biobank to build a particular prognostic score for diabetes and associated with it a very nice and easy to use user interface. You can build such direct prognostic and diagnostic scores for your disease of interest based on the data that you would like to use. Also, another challenge that AutoPrognosis can address is deciding when and if to update clinical models, because it is easy to train, and you can automatically add additional predictive variables. You can determine the optimal system to use for the new data set, thereby assessing whether you would like to update your clinical model or keep the old one. Finally, transparent reproducibility, as I mentioned, is key in everything in medicine. The majority of papers I see in the clinical community not always provide publicly the way in which they have trained their clinical scores and how they have optimized their variables. AutoPrognosis, on the other hand, provides a standardized, publicly available, state-of-the-art framework that can facilitate reproducibility. Again, the software associated with AutoPrognosis can be downloaded on our GitHub. And as I mentioned, the focus is on both expert as well as non-expert users. Finally, if you are an expert user, then we would like to invite you to a session that is dedicated to machine learning researchers in healthcare on November 22nd at 4 p.m. This is in addition to our Revolutionizing Healthcare session that is going to precede it on November the 21st. And finally, I would like to remind you of our dedicated website. Thank you very much.
So I'm just going to put what Mihaela has described, this new tool, AutoPrognosis 2, the new version, into a clinical context. And unquestionably, the context that it's trying to be placed into is one where we can clearly develop and use very sophisticated machine learning or AI methods that have massive potential to impact on clinical practice. But the simple truth is that the vast majority of those don't. And they fail to make it across what was previously known for drug discovery as the valley of death, and they fail to make an impact. And the question is why, and what are the key holes that prevent them from being developed? Well, I'll show one example, a fairly recent example of an extremely sophisticated machine learning application to predict the early presence of breast cancer. This was using deep learning methods published at the highest level in Nature a couple of years back. And I'm holding up not as a poor example, it's an excellent example of a sophisticated approach, but I'm holding it up as also an example of what was missing here and what obstructs its development and translation straight into practice, because only a couple of months after this paper came out, another one was hot on its heels. And that was where others tried to simply reproduce what they had done. And in fact, it was clear that the method that they'd used was so opaque that the hyperparameters, the selection of individual parameters that were used to tune the model in the first place, were not available. Not only were they not available, but the authors, when challenged, claimed that they could not be made available. So fundamentally, this was a piece of work that had the potential to get across an impact on practice, but could never make it across there, because you're never going to get clinical acceptance unless your model is at least reproducible. Reproducible is just hurdle one. After that, you've got to go through clinical validation, arguably the much higher and harder hurdle. But for acceptance, it needs to be reproducible in the first instance. And without clear, transparent access to the hyperparameters and model tuning parameters that have been included, it's impossible for anyone to reproduce the work in the first place. And it's all there's several principles that have been clarified around what good modeling practice should incorporate. And it's interesting here, I just underlined several of them in red. They've been released by the AI for Social Good project. And I've underlined those in red that I think an AutoML framework like this addresses. The second up here is that there's value in simple solutions, and this is one of the few frameworks I'm aware of that formally compares more sophisticated machine learning approaches to traditional biostatistical tools and more simple regression methods, which ML will not always be superior than, depending on the scale of the data set and the complexity of the problem. The inclusive and accessible applications, well, democratizing ML to non-experts is the whole point of this AutoML approach. Clearly, well-defining goals and models is inherent in this process. Partnerships I'll come back to in a second, because I think it's increasingly challenging and difficult for clinicians to engage and interact with ML approaches as ML becomes ever more sophisticated. And medicine finds it hard to keep pace with that. And you have experts in cutting edge ML, experts in the medical domain, and actually spanning those two is increasingly difficult. But tools like this make it more accessible to the non-experts and actually allow more sophisticated tools to be used for the benefits they provide. Maintaining trust is absolutely critical, and the transparency I've mentioned is central to that. Reducing development costs is critical for getting anything across that chasm into clinical practice, and that includes development of the sort of accessible platforms to play with a model that Mihaela has described. Improving data readiness in those early pre-processing steps shouldn't be underestimated either. As anyone who's tried to build a model probably knows, about 80 to 90% of the workload often goes in that pre-processing, tuning, hyperparameter selection phase, and actually building them or running the model itself. By the time you get to that stage, it's usually comparatively straightforward. But one other thing I wanted to stress is the importance and the increasing difficulty of bringing domain knowledge, and by that I mean clinical domain knowledge, to bear on the building of ML models in healthcare. This is probably my favorite example of that, mainly because it's been systematically sourced from 10 years worth of crowdsourced challenge with the DREAM Consortium, where they basically ran crowdsourced challenges on gold standard data sets and asked people to come and try through a series of challenges to build models that could predict certain endpoints. And after 10 years, they looked back at what the key features of high-performing models were. And it was clear that ensemble models of the sort that the AutoML framework here produce were extremely high-performing, but so were domain-informed models. And by that, I don't mean simply models that, for example, use natural language processing to source domain knowledge from a data set itself. I mean models that were built with clinical domain experts involved. And there have been some fairly high profile examples of how things can go wrong when that isn't the case. So Google Flu Trends, perhaps, one of the more high profile ones. So including domain experts, clinical domain experts in the model building process can be critical. But interestingly, the one thing that they identified was that the high performing models tended to be black box models, and that they identified the outstanding challenge of trying to build interpretable models that could perform at the same level, but that could also be interpretable to tell us why they were making the predictions they were making. And again, I think things have changed since these days, described in this 10-year retrospective, and that models are much more interpretable. And that's a critical component, not just of debugging, but of understanding the model and gaining the trust and acceptance that's necessary as well. So just a very brief run through of a couple of the core components that I think make this sort of automated framework a perfect way for clinical domain experts to avoid the need to try and turn themselves into machine learning domain experts, but yet to be able to robustly, transparently, and reproducibly apply and hopefully then translate their modeling into clinical impact without sacrificing accuracy, of course. So that's just a very quick run through of the context for me.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Tom Callender. I'm a public health doctor by background and a clinical academic at UCL. And I thought I would talk you through a little bit of the example that I've had in using AutoPrognosis to solve a particular public health problem, but would start by framing it within the context of automated machine learning overall. And so I thought if you take the kind of four main stages of clinical risk prediction, you've got the development and then external evaluation, deployment of the models, and then ongoing monitoring over time. And each of these stages has multiple steps within them. And then if you take the kind of analogy with autonomous vehicles, and if you had a model that could do all of these and all of the sub-steps, then you'd have full automation. But where we are now is more like developer assistance. So we have tools and packages that allow us to fit models to data, be it in Python or R or Stata or something like that. But we at the moment have to specify almost every element of this. And increasingly, we've had some partial automation. So particularly within the machine learning world, perhaps dealing with optimal hyperparameters, there's bits of software that can support in managing that. But where I think AutoPrognosis really fits in is in this conditional automation, where you can specify the predictors, but the software is capable of performing the steps of model development independently. And why I think this is really important is that if we were to consider what Mihaela showed beforehand, so all of the background, all of the different algorithms that are available in AutoPrognosis, we have the brilliant thing that over the last decade or so, we've seen loads of new machine learning algorithms for risk prediction. But the real challenge is that despite all of this hype, we've not, I mean, to my knowledge, there's not a single one of these that has actually been used in any of the main risk prediction tools that you see in clinical practice today. And I think one of the reasons behind this is that there is a lot of complexity and expertise required to tune and optimize each one of these models. Knowing which one to use is challenging, particularly as they're all relatively new. And so often what you'll see is that people fall back on tried and tested methods. And that means almost exclusively logistic regression and Cox proportional hazard models. But as we know, there's no free lunch. So a Cox model, although good in some circumstances, is not going to be perfect for every data set. And this really matters that we're not trying all of the statistical tools at our disposal, because it requires a lot of resources, a lot of expertise, immense amounts of time to actually get a clinical risk prediction tool from, say, bench to bedside. We're talking about years worth of work and a lot of papers. And so what tends to happen is that once a model is okay and it's in clinical practice, it's very hard to see that model change or be supplanted, despite the fact that models are not like aspirin. They're not based on biological mechanisms that mean that they don't change over time. Models do degrade over time. The data on which they were built is often no longer relevant. And so it's important that we get it right the first time and that we use all of the statistical approaches that we have. But more than that, the other thing with automated machine learning is that whether or not you're a machine learning expert or a clinician who's not necessarily a machine learning expert, it's almost impossible to see mathematically how you could, as an individual, put all of these things together without some form of automated machine learning. Getting the right pipelines for each specific task is a little bit like completing a Rubik's Cube. And it's not something that we can spend our time doing, particularly as there's some papers that have shown that nearly 95% of time in building a machine learning model, once you've got past the kind of data cleaning, is spent with software tooling. So sitting there programming, which is not something that most clinicians are going to be doing. So overall, I think that this is a really important step, not only for clinicians, but also in enabling us to be able to really take advantage of everything at our disposal. And so what did we do? Well, I had the specific problem of lung cancer screening, and we tackled this from the issue of, in the UK and in Europe, we are in the process of thinking about lung cancer screening based on risk prediction models. So in this situation, we take the entire population, we work out people's risk of developing or dying from lung cancer, and then depending on their risk, we think about whether or not we can screen them. Now, in national screening, in national programs like the UK or in most European countries, that means we have to be able to do something centrally, or it's got to be really simple. We can't just fall back on general practitioners in the primary care system. But the current program has involved two different models, which have 19 variables between them, most of which are not in the electronic health records. And so once we got to the point of actually implementing this at the national scale, we started to see how this is nearly impossible. And the minute that you have multiple conditions for which we're doing risk prediction, which is increasingly the case, the number of man hours just in doing risk scores becomes an insuperable challenge. So we thought, well, could we turn the problem on its head? And could we use the power of something like AutoPrognosis to maximize parsimony? And this is what we achieved. So we used 3 variables instead of the usual 12 to 19, age, smoking duration, and pack years, and found that this was enough within an ensemble machine learning approach to be able to reach parity or even exceed parity with all of the existing models, both in a UK cohort and in a US cohort. But what AutoPrognosis allowed us to do also was from the second hat. So that was the first hat as a public health doctor, something that's implementable. But also we started off by wanting to know more from the research perspective, what are the important variables? And here we've done it with ours, and that's how we kind of decided to focus on those 3 main variables, as they were obviously doing most of the work in these bigger models. But Fergus and others in Mihaela's group have shown this very nicely with the diabetes model, showing how you can use something like AutoPrognosis to really tell the importance of different numbers of variables, and then you can go back and think, okay, fine, so now if we could have 20 or 40 variables, fine, but how do we actually implement it, and where is the sweet spot that allows us to do the best we can? But most importantly, with anything that's automated machine learning, we shouldn't use it in clinical practice, and we never will use it without some way of being able to explain it. And it's here that the new version of AutoPrognosis is really a step up, in that it allows us to add in things like shape values and see, for our case, what happened, what were the important values, what are the interactions between the values. And we can do this both at an aggregate level, but we can also do this at the individual level. And this is something with some of these new white boxing techniques that actually provides almost an advantage of machine learning, in that it's one thing knowing what a regression coefficient is, but it's really quite another thing being able to verify whether your model is making sense to that individual in front of you, if it's saying that the relevant things that as a clinician you would think are doing the prediction are actually doing those predictions. So overall, for us, we found that this is has been a fantastic piece of software, but I also think that it really does hold the potential to act as your co-pilot in developing new risk prediction models. It is fundamentally a low cost in terms of time, low code framework that abstracts away a lot of the challenges and frankly quite banal aspects of tooling a lot of machine learning, and makes it accessible to both experts and non-experts alike. And I think as a result, it's a good way of working out where machine learning will be important, but also allowing us to really focus much more on the holistic development of models that are actually useful, rather than just producing more models for the sake of it. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. So maybe if you allow me, I will start, and then I'm giving it to you to ask the next question. But as a machine learner, I wanted to ask all 3 of you, with your different perspectives, what do you think about the potential use of this tool? Where do you think would be most valuable in the clinical ecosystem and healthcare ecosystem? And what can we do to further improve this tool to make it hopefully even more useful for you and your colleagues? I don't know who would like to start. Shall I start with you, Suetonia, and then maybe Don, and then Paul?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. While I was listening to your presentations, so many questions were coming out. So my background is that I'm a kidney specialist, and I'm also a clinical trialist. And we have a lot of wicked problems in kidney medicine. Kidney medicine costs 1% of our health budget, so it's incredibly expensive for about 0.08% of our population. And our patients have terrible quality of life on dialysis, worse than most advanced cancers. So it's incredibly important for us to be able to provide those patients and their families with very detailed understanding of what is likely for them when they're making complex decisions about whether or not to have dialysis. And the other set of really wicked problems are around donation for kidney transplantation. We have families who are donating a kidney to a friend or a relative, and to understand their prognosis and what are the most important factors for them around their kidney health into the future. So those are some of just the things that are springing to mind. I saw the question on the chat around longitudinal data. I think that is going to be perhaps one of the places where AutoPrognosis 3.0, can we talk about it already, will be profound in terms of longitudinal management. Just briefly, one more comment is that given that dialysis and transplantation are so expensive, we need to support our health systems to model what the demand is going to be over the next 10, 20 years. A lot of these treatments require capital expenditure, unlike other treatments such as chemotherapy or antibiotics. So our treatments require the building of buildings, and it's so important for health systems to understand what the demand is going to be in the next 10, 20 years. So I'm just really excited to see that we might have some clues about the answers to these questions with tools like this.
Thank you, Suetonia. Before I I give the microphone to Don, let me just again reemphasize that this is not necessarily only for predictions and time to event analysis for disease, but it could also be used for capacity and demand. And this is actually one of the uses we have had in the past with NHS Digital. Don.
And I think, sorry, and I think that's particularly where, for my area of medicine, it's going to be so profound, because we have very poor tools for understanding demand, and we also have very few tools to understand what predicts demand, which particular variables in our field are the most important. I think that's a huge black box for us, and I think this kind of analysis will reveal those things and help us make decisions on the ground much more easily.
So there's so many different things that my mind is stimulated by this. You know, first off, I guess the last presentation, I got the feel that you were basically you're developing a prognostic capability based at the population level, right, with smoking. But I assume you could use the same approach with individual patients by looking at their own, you know, history of multiple factors, which is probably, you know, part of the longitudinal, but rather than forward longitudinal, like using their individual patient histories to prognose their individual likelihood of, you know, something happening. I think that could be hugely valuable. I think the population prediction could be hugely valuable to save costs by saying which patients need to be seen once a year versus every 6 months versus every 5 years, you know, things like that, which is not done now, right? It's still, everybody does it the same. Personally, you know, I work more at the discovery level, so I am sure that one could adapt these same approaches for drug discovery, and the tools, you know, which measurements, which preclinical assays are the most meaningful to predict a clinical response in a clinical trial, things like that. You know, we use existing ML a lot for drug development and molecular design of new therapeutics, but I think, you know, you could apply it in all these areas. However, there's one thing that caught me, as I'm someone who works a lot on translation and commercialization, as well as, you know, being an academic. You said you really want this to be free and out there, which is laudable and great, but usually, at least in my world, it will never get out there unless someone has intellectual property, so if they can make the capital investment, the commitment to bring this to, you know, scale. And so, you know, I honestly don't know how it works clinically, whether just a bunch of papers means that people are comfortable to use this in their clinical practice. It's hard for me to believe that. I would think you need to do some kind of significant trial. So, you know, either you're going to have to get an investment in your academic institution to scale this to the point where it can be done, you know, and convince people to do trials, which often means paying their staff, or, you know, or I just be wary about putting it all out there, because I know in my world, if you come up with a cancer drug and you publish it, it will never get to patients unless there's IP, and it's too late. So you need to think carefully about that. So, I mean, I could think of many other things that could be useful, but those are things that just came to mind as I was listening.
Don, I will let my clinical colleagues and Tom to respond to the clinical points, but the way in which we envision that this tool will be used is it will enable others to build tools and build scores and build analytics, and then they can take this to commercialization potentially, but using at least this tool. So we view this tool almost like democratizing machine learning, and then
so that's one way of viewing it. The real world is usually, unless the visionary person champions it themselves, it never happens. Because other people will get involved in some little thing, or they'll use it poorly and it'll kill the whole industry. You know, I just think you need to think about that carefully.
Thank you for the advice. Thank you very much.
I think that's a good, just to pick up on that, I think it's a great point. And I think that probably drove much of the lack of transparency in the paper that I outlined with regards to breast cancer prediction. They were challenged in print, in Nature. They didn't provide their code. And I think the basic reason was they didn't want to, because they had something protectable. But as Mihaela says, this would facilitate transparency. Now you can then be transparent and protect, but it's someone else who would use the tool to generate the thing that would be protected rather than the tool itself. How that fits, so this would then facilitate getting across that chasm, making tools that were potentially implementable. How we as a medical community facilitate that and maintain investment, so protect things yet make them transparent at the same time, I think that's a real tough one.
I would suggest that the company that published a Nature paper, and then another paper came out saying they couldn't repeat it, if it's a good company, is not going to give out that code, and it's going to basically find the funds to do a clinical trial to get the data that the FDA would be convinced it's acceptable. And if they are convinced, then that second paper was meaningless. And I've seen this in science, you know, second papers in the same journal show they couldn't repeat it, but then other people a year later repeat it. And so, you know, you have to be careful. It's not so simple. That said, there's nothing wrong with getting this out there so a lot of people explore it. But if you really want to have it widespread, disseminated, used by people around the world, somebody's going to have to pay for those studies that are convincing to both regulators and clinicians. And that's a hard one.
No,
Paul, maybe you as a regulator, maybe we can let Paul as a regulator say something about this, both as an entrepreneur and as a regulator.
Well, maybe with my entrepreneur hat on it, and it's a really important point Don makes. And I wonder whether in a future session, if you haven't covered it already, intellectual property and patentability or non-patentability of AI would be interesting, because there are ways around it. And I think what you really need is you need longevity of the solution, both reproducibility and longevity, because as a clinician, you need the time to really prove out, but also to adjust clinical pathways to accommodate the solution. And if the academic group which has built it has then moved on or lost interest, lost funding, whatever, it's going to be a real problem. And that's why, as Don says, it for many products, it requires a lot of investment in companies. But with the sort of problems that AI could have a massive impact on and AutoPrognosis, it may be other sorts of groups, such as charities or some of the academic funding bodies could progress things. And I think sort of, because it's very exciting, I think one of the sort of Cinderella aspects of the whole process is the data curation. And there are various reasons why the data quality is so poor. If we could persuade clinicians of the value and the tractability, then I think they'd be more willing to get things in a better form to then apply ML to. And the fact that this is, and particularly if you could have some sort of explainer videos of the process, really building on what Tom has done to help the general clinician who is not going to ever really be an academic, because it's still a leap up, even with all of your tools, there's a leap up. And I think so my sort of final sort of observation on it is you could go sort of deep and narrow, which is sort of what tends to happen. So a particular disease problem, image analysis of a retinal photograph, or broad, and some of the broad things are potentially more impactful and really need that they uniquely need machine learning. And there are a couple, if I've got time to mention. One is it's around safety of products. So MHRA, FDA, patients want products to patients as quickly as possible. But the quicker you bring them forwards, the greater the risk. And so that fights against the desire to have really safe products. And the way you can reconcile that is by having really good data flows and how products are performing in real life. It's something which is called pharmacovigilance. But if you've got large data sets and you want to pick up a signal very early on, you've got to have machine learning. So this could be a solution to a real broad set of problems. And a related thing is to the other sort of big issue in healthcare is a lack of healthcare professionals. Worldwide, there are not enough clinicians. What is happening is there are different flavors of healthcare professionals, physician associates, nurse associates, and delegation to them. With delegation comes increased risk. So you need monitoring of how they're performing, and you want to pick up the sort of the smoke before the fire rises. And at the minute, it's only when there's a big disaster that things are picked up. So with ML, you can get quality by design in these big areas. And that's what I'd be really interested in looking at.
Can I add something to that? Because that was great. A couple of things. One is that when I was talking about like using preclinical data, I mean, that's a great example where taking the right toxicity data and the right efficacy data and in the preclinical phase and be able to predict, which drugs are more likely to be safe and shorten that process has a huge value to pharma industry, healthcare system. The other thing is that from the commercialization standpoint, if I were to make any suggestion, I would say do both. Make it open, but choose like some high value proof of principle that you protect. You're not going to probably protect it with IP because it's all software. So, it's all know-how. So, have a group of people, get investors and form an entity, and you go for that. Now, thinking about it, you did cystic fibrosis work. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, has billions of dollars, billions, and they invest in major drug development programs. That's a great example, and that's an example.
We are funded by the Cystic Fibrosis Trust to develop tools, so maybe we can bring it up to them.
You can think about just doing that all the way for that one disease and be able to predict, which patients are seen often, which get therapies.
Actually, for the interest of everyone here, I have from my previous life as a Philips research scientist, 35 patents from my early life. Before I was 30, I was in a company working for Philips Research, and actually algorithms can be patented. This type of algorithms actually can be patented. We decided not to, partially because we wanted people to use and build on. But the reality is that different types of algorithms can be patented. So, but that maybe we can leave for another discussion, just dedicated to this. And thank you very much, Don and Paul, for bringing that up.
Yes, we have questions from the audience as well that I would like to come up. And the first one you had the hand up earlier was Gabriel Iniscu. So if you would like to come on and ask your question.
Hi, it's a very interesting discussion. I'm Gabriel Iniscu. I'm a transplant surgeon in Edinburgh, and I was listening to some of the conversation. I think there are a couple of points I'd like to make. First of all, there's the first algorithm that's approved by FDA. as an endpoint for clinical trials and outcome measuring. That's called the iBox, developed by the French group. So clearly we're moving towards technologies driven by ML and AI. The question is NHS ready for this? And I think some of the points you made about data availability are very good. But it has to be democratized, because it's not about patenting in all areas. Eventually, medicine will become dependent on those. So I think it is important that it's developed in all areas. So I think that's a key point. And how do we get the clinicians to engage, and how do we get the data better so we can actually create the accurate models?
Thank you very much for the comment. And we also have Richard Pack, who would like to ask a question.
It's not so much a question, Andreas, as a comment. I'm a clinical pharmacologist. I'm thinking about the business model and Don Ingber's comment. So my pedigree is clinical pharmacology, and the closest analogy I can think of at the moment are some of the software tools that have been developed to enable population pharmacokinetic analyses and PK/PD analyses. And several of those were developed and given away free. And you build a user base, and you get people familiar with the tool, you get them confident in the tool, you get them understanding what it can do, and then companies started to require licenses for the next version, and so on and so forth. So in terms of the business model, I actually rather like the get people using it, and you're only going to do that if it's for free. But there may be actually a future way of making money out of the software if somebody wants to do that. I guess, Mihaela, if you want to do that. The related comment is, of course, anyone who then wishes to use some aspect of the tool to develop a prediction model that they then actually want to try to use to manage patients is likely, as you say, Don, they're going to have to do the clinical trials. That's likely to require significant investment. But I don't think that's the initial intent, the initial aim. I think it's more at the moment, as I understand it, to get something out there that people start to use and that builds the belief and builds the confidence to then move to the next step of actually starting to create applications that might be businesses in themselves. That's it, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think, Suetonia, you want to say something to that?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is such an important conversation. My experience as a clinician is that tools need to be freely available and usable. So my background is in very large scale meta-analysis and very large scale network meta-analysis, which has answered some really important questions in my field. And I've used tools that have been made widely available and democratized by the collaboration, the Cochrane collaboration, and statisticians within the Cochrane collaboration. And without that availability, I would not have been able to use those tools. And I see that this is very similar. I'm in a situation where I simply couldn't afford to contact a company and ask them to run these tools for me. And I do agree that I think there would be very significant interest from public funding of health research in these tools. So I would envisage that my own public funding organisation through the government, which is similar to the NIHR and the NIH, would be incredibly interested in this type of work, not only at the trial stage, but also at the hypothesis generating stage. So I agree, I think, Richard, that we need to see this used and widely used for a number of applications. I think quality control is important as a consideration. We have very little quality control over the use of Cox regression, so that's a challenge in itself. But I think democratization for a wide variety of health settings where ML just isn't usable at the moment is really fundamental.
Thank you very much. I would like to hand over back to Eoin for a question from him. If anyone in the audience, if you're not getting through with your questions today, we encourage you to come back to our next session in November and also engage with our content over the coming weeks on our website. So Eoin, if you would like to ask.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I was just going to. I can see George Vasili's got his hand up as well. Should we take one more from the group, George?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks. It's a very mundane question from me. We building a model to predict, let's say, the presence of a certain blood phenomenon. Where so far what we've done with regression is telling us that some of our variables may be independently predicting the same thing, so they may be correlated between them. So we want to understand if your tool will enable us to extract which of the variables are affecting our prediction.
Yeah, that's exactly what it would do. It's very likely that you've got a series of complex nonlinear interactions between a lot of different variables that may improve your predictive performance rather than simply measuring one or two and doing a simple regression model. That's exactly what this would be designed to help you do in the first place. There's no guarantee that it will be better than regression, but it will let you formally compare side by side whether those more simplistic methods or the more sophisticated ones can improve your performance, and if so, by how much. And clearly, the more variables you put in, the more complexity you have, and that's another thing that, from a feature selection point of view, this allows you to iterate.
Thank you very much.
We did have another one from Johan in the chat, which I might just read out. Johan, I don't know if you want to read it out yourself or I can read it. I can't scan everyone to see if they're there. You are.
I can read it. First of all, of course, congratulations for the nice work you've done with AutoPrognosis. Is impressive. I just had one remark. Recently, there was a lot of interest in reproducibility of machine learning models. There was a nice workshop at Princeton University. I've given the link there, and you can find all the presentations also on YouTube. And one of the reasons that they mentioned for the reproducibility crisis of machine learning models was that a lot of, let's say, non-experts start using machine learning, and there are a lot of pitfalls. I just wonder how you look at it, because what you want now to do is that all clinicians start using building machine learning models without really understanding what they are doing. Or am I wrong with my
yes, if you allow me to take that one, thank you very much for your point. We completely agree. So there are two parts to reproducibility. One is the fact that there is no one comprehensive framework that people can go to add new models, to validate models, and report in a consistent way which models were used and associated hyperparameters. AutoPrognosis framework can solve that first part of the challenge. The second challenge, which you rightly mentioned, is how people engage with these tools. This is why we have this Revolutionizing Healthcare session, but also we hope to have subsequent sessions and also tutorials and join forces with hopefully many of you in the audience who are interested in understanding, promoting, but also debugging this type of tools, to go to the various communities, various clinical communities, but also regulators and maybe hospital managers, to bring these tools to their attentions and work together with them to make sure that they know how to engage correctly with these tools. And in the process, hopefully understand when these tools are useful and maybe when are they useful, and also make sure that the right engagement is done. So I think that this is just the beginning of the journey, as you rightly point out. We need now to go back to various communities and engage with them and hopefully bring this tool to their attention and think what's the correct way to engage with it and provide demonstrators and exemplars. Thank you very much for the question.
And thank you very much for everyone on the panel. We have reached the end of our session today. Thank you very much for the introductory talks by Mihaela and Tom. And thank you very much to Don Paul and Suetonia for your comments on the panel. And thank you for everyone who asked a question and engaged with us today. Again, I would like to point you towards our next session that will be in November on the same topic, where we will have more feedback, more discussion. And in the work up to this, please have a look at our AutoPrognosis website. I've also posted it into the chat. And the video of today's session will come up in the next 1 or 2 days as well. So you can rewatch everything. You can show it around to whoever you like to share this with. And join us on our journey with AutoPrognosis. And let please your other practicing clinician friends know about the upcoming sessions and Revolutionizing Healthcare in general, so we can have another 20 sessions to come, which are very interesting and will range through a lot of topics. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. And I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.